At the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, we provide safe, affordable housing opportunities to enhance the quality of life of North Carolinians.
To accomplish this, we work with thousands of partners statewide to not only expand affordable housing opportunities, but to make sure this housing is available to anyone in need without exception. More than 50 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed Title V of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, more commonly referred to as the Fair Housing Act.
This law made it illegal to discriminate in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 expanded coverage to prohibit discrimination based on disability or familial status. The North Carolina Fair Housing Act builds on these federal protections by including low-income individuals as a protected class.
Other federal laws that apply to fair housing include the Americans with Disabilities Act, which became law in 1990.
And Title III of the ADA, which became effective 2 years later and prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodations, including privately owned businesses.
For people with disabilities, fair housing goes beyond discrimination and additionally prohibits failure to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, and services to provide equal opportunity for a person with a disability to occupy and enjoy the full use of a housing unit. Fair housing also prohibits failure to allow reasonable modification of premises necessary to do the same.
How can you make sure you are properly complying with reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities?
Requests by a tenant for reasonable accommodations and modifications should be met with an individualized assessment of the person's needs.
The tenant must request the accommodation, and in doing so must reveal that they have a disability.
Property managers may request proof of disability and may also request additional information that accommodation or modification is necessary.
However, further inquiry into the nature and type of disability must be limited to matters directly related to the request for accommodation or modification.
One example of a reasonable accommodation is the use of a service animal. Service animals are not pets and therefore are not subject to restrictions under the manager's pet policy. Property managers cannot collect fees or a pet deposit. However, they can charge for damages caused by the animal.
Property managers must keep the following in mind when evaluating fair housing in their units. Rental assistance must be taken into consideration when evaluating the tenant's ability to pay rent. Undue delay in responding to requests for reasonable accommodations or modifications could be seen as a refusal to make an accommodation and is a violation of the law. If a tenant submits a request in response to a lease termination or eviction notice, the termination process should not continue until a decision on the request has been made and communicated to the tenant.
There are many ways that you can ensure that you follow fair housing laws. You can develop and implement clear policies and fair housing practices and have these policies reviewed by a fair housing expert, support diversity and cultural awareness in your business, understand the senior housing exemption if your community is a senior living development, be proactive in making fair housing an everyday part of your business, and promote fair housing through continued education.
For more information and guidance for property owners and managers, read our Fair Housing for Tenants with Disabilities, Understanding Reasonable Accommodations and Reasonable Modifications on our agency's website.
Aside from physical, behavioral, and mental disabilities, rental owners and managers must also provide accommodations for persons with limited English proficiency, or LEP. There are at least 380 languages spoken in the United States, and more than 4% of households in North Carolina have limited English proficiency.
The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency requires all funding recipients to complete a 4-factor analysis to understand the number or proportion of LEP people to be served or encountered, the frequency with which LEP individuals encounter the program, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided, the resources available to the recipient and the cost of these resources, and the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency's guidance for developing a 4-factor analysis in LAP and HUD's Language Access Services resources.
To accommodate LEP people, rental owners and managers may need to identify their potential points of contact with staff, identify ways language assistance will be provided, provide appropriate translated notes to them, including eviction notices and emergency plans, and provide interpreters for meetings. Violations for rental owners and managers who do not follow the law are expensive. Just a few recent examples include $15,000 for refusing or delaying a request for parking accommodations, $72,000 for refusing a grant, a request for a service animal, $95,000 for refusing to rent to families with children.
Adhering to fair housing laws will ensure that you remain in compliance and avoid penalties. The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency provides extensive resources on our website to help apartment owners and managers comply with federal and state regulations. These resources include reasonable accommodation, a quick guide for property managers, and fair housing for tenants with disabilities, understanding reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. You can find compliance resources in the Rental Housing Partners section of housingbuildsnc.com.
Other resources include the North Carolina Fair Housing Project at fairhousingnc.org and the Fair Housing section on HUD.gov.
Our agency also recommends that you and your staff attend fair housing classes to become proficient with the rules and regulations and how to remain in compliance. Your local apartment association offers fair housing classes. You can find your local association and classes through the National Apartment Association at naahq.org. You also can access online trainings through the Fair Housing Institute at fairhousinginstitute.com. By working together, we can not only provide more affordable housing opportunities across the state, but can ensure that these opportunities are accessible to all North Carolinians who need them.